Blackwater Lake was always hidden in the shadows, a place people didn't talk about unless they had to. The water was as dark as ink, and the fog that hung over it seemed to never leave. No matter the season, a chill clung to the air, making the lake feel more like a graveyard than a peaceful retreat. The town nearby had its share of rumors, but none more unsettling than the legend of the birds. Birds no one saw in daylight, but whose cries echoed through the night. Rachel hadn't thought much of these stories. She didn't believe in curses or ghosts. To her, the lake was just an escape, a place where she could grieve quietly after her aunt's sudden death. When she arrived, the old house on the lakefront was exactly as she remembered from childhood visits. Dusty, cold, and a little too quiet. It was perfect for what she thought she needed. Time alone to heal. The house had been in the family for generations, and with her aunt gone, it now belonged to Rachel. Despite the sadness hanging over the place, there was a strange comfort in being there, like it was waiting for her. She stood on the porch, staring out at the still waters of Blackwater Lake, thinking back to how her aunt used to sit in the same spot for hours, as if listening to something only she could hear. As night began to fall, Rachel felt a sense of peace wash over her. The sun set behind the thick woods, leaving the lake bathed in shadow. But just as she was about to head inside, something strange caught her attention. A faint sound, like the distant cry of a bird, echoed from across the water. It was soft at first, almost comforting, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She brushed it off, convincing herself it was just an owl or some other bird in the forest. But as the night deepened, the sound returned, this time louder, sharper, more unsettling. It wasn't a call of any bird she knew. It was wrong, as if the bird was crying out in pain or warning. The lake, once a peaceful retreat, now felt hostile, like it was watching her. Rachel stepped back into the house, closing the door behind her, but the feeling lingered. She pushed the thought away and went to bed, telling herself it was nothing. But as she lay there, her mind kept returning to the sound, to the way it seemed to pierce the night air. It wasn't until much later, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that she remembered what the locals had always said: the birds of Blackwater Lake don't sing for the living. The next morning, Rachel woke up feeling unsettled, though she couldn't quite place why. The strange bird call from the night before lingered in her mind. The daylight had brought some relief, and the lake outside her window looked calm, ordinary even. It was hard to believe that just hours before, it had felt so threatening. She shook off the feeling and decided to explore the house more, hoping to distract herself. While rummaging through an old chest in the living room, she came across a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. As she opened it, she recognized her aunt's handwriting. It seemed her aunt had kept detailed notes in her final years. Notes about the lake, the surrounding woods, and, most unsettling of all, the birds. Rachel read the entries carefully. At first, the journal seemed like an ordinary diary, filled with everyday thoughts and observations. But as the entries progressed, they grew darker, more frantic. Her aunt had written about hearing strange bird calls at night, much like the one Rachel had heard. The journal spoke of restless nights, of feeling watched, and of the uneasy presence that seemed to surround the lake after sunset. One entry in particular caught Rachel's eye. It described the legend of the birds in chilling detail. According to the story, hundreds of years ago, the land around Blackwater Lake was home to a rare species of birds, thought to be sacred by the native people. The settlers who arrived didn't care for the land's history or its protectors. They viewed the birds as a nuisance and slaughtered them, unaware that they were inviting a curse upon themselves. The journal continued with a warning. The birds were said to return, not in flesh but in spirit. Their cries would echo through the night, bringing misfortune to anyone who heard them. For those unlucky enough to hear their call, tragedy was inevitable. The locals believed that the birds were harbingers of death, their cries a signal that something terrible was coming. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she read the final note. Her aunt had written that she, too, had heard the birds, just days before she fell ill. It was as if the birds had marked her for something. The realization hit Rachel hard. Her aunt hadn't died suddenly or naturally. She had known it was coming. She had heard the birds. The sun outside was still bright, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She glanced out the window, her eyes drawn once again to the still, black waters of the lake. The house felt colder, the air heavier. The legend, once just a story, now felt like a looming shadow, creeping closer. That night, Rachel would hear the birds again, and this time they would be much louder. That night, the house felt different. The usual creaks and groans of the old wood seemed louder, more insistent, like the house was alive and shifting around her. Rachel tried to brush off her growing unease as nothing more than her mind playing tricks after reading her aunt's journal. She convinced herself the legend was just that, a story, something locals made up to spook outsiders. But as darkness settled in, so did the familiar tension in the air. She lay in bed, trying to sleep, but the silence of the night seemed unnatural. The stillness was heavy, pressing down on her. Then, just as her eyes began to close, she heard it again, the bird call. Only this time, it wasn't distant. It was right outside her window. Rachel froze. The sound wasn't like anything she had ever heard from a bird. It was sharp and piercing, cutting through the quiet night like a blade. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her eyes, but all she could see was the thick fog swirling over the lake. No birds, no movement, just darkness. For several minutes, she stayed there, waiting, listening. The call came again, this time from the opposite side of the house. A chill crawled up her spine. There was no way a bird could move that fast, not without being seen. The thought sent a jolt of fear through her, and she quickly shut the curtain, stepping back into the safety of the room. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just an owl, or maybe some other animal calling out in the night. But the sounds continued, first a low, mournful cry, then a rhythmic tapping at the window. It was as if something was trying to get in. Rachel's heart raced. She knew she had to check, but fear kept her rooted in place. Gathering her courage, she moved to the window again, pulling the curtain aside in one swift motion. But there was nothing. No birds, no figures in the fog, only the black water of the lake rippling slightly in the breeze. Breathing heavily, she tried to make sense of it, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The tapping, the bird calls, they weren't normal. It felt as though the birds were playing with her, testing her, waiting for her to give in to the fear. Rachel tried to distract herself, flipping through the journal again. Her aunt's final entries were filled with frantic notes about the birds. The more she read, the more it became clear. Her aunt hadn't been imagining things. She had heard the same sounds, experienced the same fear, and just like Rachel, she hadn't known what to do. The last line of the entry echoed in Rachel's mind. Once you hear their call, they never leave you. They come closer each night until... The words trailed off, unfinished. Rachel shut the journal, her hands trembling. She didn't want to think about what her aunt had meant by until, but as the night dragged on and the bird calls grew more frequent, the truth became harder to deny. The birds weren't just a story, they were real, and they were getting closer. The following nights were worse. The bird calls had become a regular occurrence, always starting as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Each night, they seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and every time they came, they seemed closer. Rachel could no longer dismiss them as animals in the woods. These weren't the sounds of any creature she had ever known. It felt as though the birds were watching her, waiting for something. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit kitchen, staring blankly at her cup of coffee, she decided to reach out to Mark, her childhood friend who still lived in the nearby town. He had always been skeptical of the stories around Blackwater Lake, but maybe he would know more about the curse her aunt had written about. When she called, he picked up quickly, and she could hear the unease in his voice when she mentioned the strange bird sounds she'd been hearing. "Rachel, you need to get out of that house," Mark warned, his voice serious. "I've heard those stories my whole life. People who hear those birds, they don't last long. Your aunt, she was obsessed with them before she died. Everyone in town knew. She kept talking about how they were coming for her, and then, just like that, she was gone." Rachel shuddered at his words. "But it's just a story, right? I mean, it can't be real." Mark was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, Rachel, but I do know that everyone who's lived by that lake has either moved away or, well, let's just say none of them had happy endings. There's something wrong with that place. You need to leave." Rachel wanted to believe that it was all in her head, that the strange sounds were just a product of her imagination, but the fear gnawing at her was too real. After hanging up with Mark, she felt a deep sense of dread settle in. Leaving seemed like the logical choice, but something kept her there. It wasn't just the house or the memories of her aunt. It was as if the lake itself was holding her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. That night, the tapping on the windows returned. Rachel had tried to block it out, moving to different rooms, closing all the curtains, but the noise followed her. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was scratching, as though sharp claws were dragging across the glass. She covered her ears, trying to drown out the sound, but it seeped through, burrowing into her mind. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Rachel held her breath, listening. Then, without warning, she heard a loud crash from the living room. Her heart jumped into her throat as she rushed to the door, terrified of what she might find. When she entered the room, her breath caught in her chest. The window facing the lake was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The cold night air rushed in, making her skin prickle. She slowly approached the broken window, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. At first, she saw nothing but the fog drifting lazily over the water. But then, out of the mist, she saw them. Birds. Hundreds of them, their shapes barely visible in the haze, hovering just above the surface of the lake. Their glowing white eyes stared directly at her, unblinking. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. Rachel backed away, her heart racing. She slammed the door shut, her mind spinning. There was no denying it now. The birds weren't just a myth. They were real, and they were here for her. The curse was no longer a distant legend. It was alive, and it had marked her. As the birds remained at the lake's edge, unmoving, Rachel knew one thing for certain: they weren't going to leave, and neither could she. The next morning, Rachel's mind was a fog of exhaustion and dread. She hadn't slept. The image of those glowing white eyes watching her from the mist haunted her thoughts, replaying in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She had tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was losing her grip. Maybe grief over her aunt's death was twisting her perception. But deep down, she knew the truth. The birds were real, and their presence was no coincidence. Determined to understand what was happening, Rachel searched through the house, looking for anything else her aunt might have left behind. She scoured the dusty attic, flipping through old papers, letters, and photographs. Anything that might give her a clue. Finally, tucked inside an old leather-bound book, she found something. An envelope addressed to her. It was sealed, her aunt's handwriting scrawled across the front, and it looked like it had been waiting for her. With trembling hands, Rachel tore open the envelope and pulled out a letter. Her aunt's words were frantic, the handwriting shaky as if written in haste. The letter detailed everything: the curse, the birds, and the family's connection to the lake. Rachel's ancestors had been among the original settlers who had desecrated the sacred birds' nesting grounds, killing them for sport and claiming the land for themselves. The curse had been placed on their bloodline, and ever since, the birds had returned to exact their revenge, generation after generation. Rachel's eyes widened as she read the final lines of the letter. Her aunt had known all along. She had known the curse was real, and she had tried to warn Rachel, but it had been too late. The birds had come for her, just as they had for every member of the family before her. The only way to escape, her aunt wrote, was to leave the lake and never return. But even then, the curse might follow. As Rachel finished reading, the room seemed to close in around her. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Her family was responsible for this nightmare, and now the burden was on her. The realization was like a weight pressing down on her chest. There was no escaping this. She was marked, just like her aunt, just like all those before her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Mark. He had come to check on her after their last conversation, worried about her safety. His face was pale when she opened the door, and he immediately knew something was wrong. "They've come for me, Mark," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark's expression hardened. He stepped inside, glancing around the room, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "Rachel, you have to leave, now. Pack your things and we'll go. The longer you stay, the worse it will get." Rachel shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not that simple. It's not just the house. It's me. The curse, it's tied to my family. Even if I leave, it won't stop. The birds will follow. Mark didn't seem surprised by her words. He had heard the stories too many times to dismiss them now. He knew about the curse, about what had happened to those who had lived at Blackwater Lake. Then we'll figure it out. We'll find a way to break it. But you can't stay here. They'll come for you, just like they did with your aunt. Rachel wanted to believe him, but the fear had taken root too deep. She couldn't shake the feeling that her fate was already sealed. The birds were patient, relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. As the two stood in the doorway, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lake. The air grew colder, the mist creeping back over the water, and in the distance, the faint sound of bird calls began once again. They were coming. Mark grabbed Rachel's hand, pulling her toward the car. "Come on, we don't have much time." But as they reached the front steps, Rachel stopped, her eyes drawn to the lake. The fog had thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, and through it, she could see the outline of the birds. Dozens of them, circling the house, their eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. "They won't let me go," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Mark tightened his grip on her arm. "We have to try." But as the bird calls grew louder, more frantic, Rachel knew in her heart that it was too late. The curse had found her, just as it had found her aunt. And this time, there was no escape. The birds were already here. The air around the house seemed to pulse with a strange energy as the birds circled closer, their glowing eyes fixed on Rachel. Their cries, once distant and faint, now filled the night, a deafening chorus of shrieks and wails that seemed to resonate deep in her bones. She couldn't move, frozen in place as the weight of the curse settled over her like a heavy shroud. Mark pulled harder on her arm, desperation in his voice. "Rachel, we need to go. Now." But Rachel could barely hear him over the sound of the birds. She felt something pulling her toward the lake, an invisible force that seemed to wrap itself around her, drawing her closer with every passing second. Her legs felt heavy, like they weren't her own anymore, as if the lake itself was calling to her, demanding her presence. Against her will, she stepped forward, her feet moving on their own. Mark shouted her name, trying to pull her back, but it was no use. The pull was too strong. The birds' cries grew louder, more insistent, as if they were urging her on. She stumbled down the steps and onto the path that led to the lake, her eyes fixed on the black water shimmering in the distance. Mark ran after her, his voice panicked. "Rachel, stop, don't go down there." But Rachel couldn't stop. The force pulling her toward the lake was overwhelming, like an unseen hand guiding her every step. The birds swooped down around her, their wings beating against the air, brushing against her skin like cold, ghostly hands. She barely felt them, her mind clouded with a strange sense of calm, as if she was exactly where she was supposed to be. As she reached the edge of the lake, Rachel stopped, staring down into the water. The surface was unnaturally still, like a black mirror reflecting the sky. But there, just beneath the surface, something moved. Shadows shifting in the depths, swirling and coiling like dark tendrils reaching up toward her. Mark caught up to her, grabbing her by the shoulders and trying to shake her out of the trance she was in. "Rachel, look at me. Don't listen to them. You don't have to do this." But his voice seemed distant, barely cutting through the fog that had settled over her mind. The birds were everywhere now, circling above the lake, their glowing eyes watching, waiting. Rachel could feel their presence, not just around her, but inside her, as if they were part of her soul. The curse wasn't just a story, it was alive, and it had claimed her. She felt herself slipping, her body swaying toward the water. The shadows beneath the surface rippled, growing larger, more defined, and then, as if emerging from the very heart of the lake, she saw it. A massive, bird-like figure, its wings stretching wide, its eyes glowing with the same pale light as the others. But this one was different, ancient, filled with an unholy rage that sent a jolt of terror through her body. Rachel gasped, stumbling backward as the figure rose from the lake, its dark form towering over her. The birds screeched in unison, their cries merging into a single, deafening wail. The air around her seemed to hum with power, and she felt the pull again, stronger this time, as if the lake itself was demanding her to step forward. Mark, realizing what was happening, grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the edge. "Rachel, no. You can fight this." But Rachel's body moved of its own accord. Her legs carried her forward, closer to the water, closer to the dark figure waiting for her. The pull was unbearable now, like a weight dragging her down. She could feel the curse closing in around her, suffocating her, as the birds circled closer, their eyes flashing in the darkness. In a final, desperate act, Mark stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You're stronger than this, Rachel. Don't let it take you." For a moment, Rachel hesitated. Her eyes locked onto Mark's, and for the briefest second, she felt a flicker of hope. But then, the bird-like figure stretched its wings wide, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The curse was too powerful, too old, too deeply tied to her bloodline. There was no escape. With a sudden, violent motion, the figure lunged forward, and Rachel felt herself being pulled into the cold, dark water. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the birds. Mark reached for her, but it was too late. The lake swallowed her whole, dragging her down into its depths. As Rachel disappeared beneath the surface, the birds fell silent. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, as if nothing had ever happened. Mark stood frozen at the edge of the lake, staring into the still water, disbelief etched on his face. She was gone. The birds had taken her, just as they had taken all those before her. And now, the lake was calm once more, as if it had claimed what it wanted. In the eerie silence that followed, Mark could only stand there, helpless, as the mist began to creep back over the water. The curse was far from over, and as the last traces of daylight faded, the birds began to circle again, their glowing eyes watching from the shadows. Mark stood by the edge of Blackwater Lake, his mind numb with shock, his body rooted in place as if the same force that had taken Rachel held him captive. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed it. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the still, dark water, where Rachel had vanished only moments before. The birds, now nothing more than shadows in the mist, hovered silently above the lake, their presence a chilling reminder of what had just transpired. Their glowing eyes flickered faintly through the fog, watching him, as though waiting for something. But they didn't move. They didn't need to. They had already won. Mark felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. The curse had claimed another life, just as it always had. The legend of the cursed birds was no longer just a story. He had witnessed it with his own eyes. Rachel, his childhood friend, was gone, lost to the lake and the vengeful spirits that dwelled there, and there was nothing he could do to bring her back. The weight of the realization pressed down on him, suffocating. The birds had taken Rachel, just as they had taken her aunt, and everyone else who had lived by Blackwater Lake. The curse was unstoppable, relentless. It didn't matter who you were or how far you ran. Once you were marked, the birds would find you. Mark took a shaky step back from the water's edge, his mind racing. He had to leave. He had to get away from this place before it claimed him too. But as he turned to go, a soft sound stopped him in his tracks. It was faint, barely audible over the silence, but unmistakable. A single bird call, echoing from across the lake. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded harder as he slowly turned to face the water again. There, in the swirling mist, the shapes of the birds began to materialize once more. Dozens of them, circling slowly, their white eyes glowing like faint stars in the dark. Panic surged through him. He needed to leave, now. He took another step back, his mind screaming for him to run, but his feet felt like lead. The birds' eyes followed him, their calls growing louder, more insistent, like a warning. Suddenly, the mist parted, and from the depths of the lake, he saw it. The same dark figure that had risen before Rachel, its massive wings stretched wide, its body emerging from the water like a shadow come to life. It hovered above the surface, its eyes glowing with a terrible, otherworldly light. Mark stumbled back, his legs barely carrying him. The figure's gaze bore into him, cold and unfeeling. The birds around it cried out in unison, their voices merging into a single deafening wail that sent a shock of terror through him. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure sank back into the water. The birds scattered, their cries fading into the night, leaving only the sound of the wind and the gentle lapping of the lake. Mark stood there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The birds were gone for now, but the message was clear. The curse wasn't over. Rachel's fate had been sealed, just as her aunt's had been, and now the curse had marked him too. With one last glance at the lake, Mark turned and ran, the cold wind biting at his skin as he fled from Blackwater Lake, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as he ran, he knew that no distance would be far enough, because once you heard the call of the cursed birds, they would never stop. They would follow, no matter how far you went. The curse was a part of him now, and sooner or later, it would come for him too. As he disappeared into the woods, the mist rolled back over the lake, the water still and silent once more, and in the distance, the faint echo of bird calls drifted through the night air, a final, haunting reminder that Blackwater Lake never forgets. The birds would return. They always did.